Hi, I'm Thomas,
And I'm Ben.
and today on the Philosophy Show,
Causal law,
and the UK becomes totalitarian state.
that's about the arrest of Tommy Robinson.
Right.
And also the causal law thing is my new theory of causation. So I guess we'll jump right into it. So talking about causation, that's one of the big parts of metaphysics. It's something that I don't think has been solved to the satisfaction of most philosophers. Hopefully I might change that, although I think it's unlikely that most philosophers will accept what I came up with. But I think it works quite well. So in the ancient world, causation was thought to be the result of some sort of causal power, perhaps. And one of the traditional notions was one of, it was a modal notion, one of necessity. Like, A causes B if A necessitates B. So if it's impossible for A to happen and B not to happen. There were some problems with this that are best done in illustration, but we don't have illustration over audio, so I'll do my best to describe them. So one of them, for instance, might be, imagine that A causes B and C. It causes both B and C to happen. So A necessitates B and C, and also B and C cannot happen unless A happens. And so if this is the case, anytime B happens, C will also happen. Anytime C happens, B will also happen. And so by that other definition of causation, of necessity, B can be said to cause C, even though we know that B did not cause C.
Alright. One issue, I'm sure you've already postulated about it previously, but by that definition of causation, you mentioned that, for example, by definition, B is impossible without A when you're defining it. How would you determine the possibility or impossibility of something occurring without something else? What kind of an approach would you take, or would the ancient Greeks have taken?
Not sure this was thought about too much. I think much of it would be based in fundamental metaphysics. And I think this is one of the things that still need to be figured out, because my theory of causation takes this traditional theory of causation that had been thrown out a while ago, pretty much, and takes it back and modifies it and sort of makes it work according to certain laws.
Alright.
And so exactly what the causal laws are is still something I need to work on. But I think we might be able to say that there's some sort of a priori basis to how we know that one thing must cause another thing.
Alright, so what I was getting at before, I was referring to induction versus deduction, although I suppose I'm far too of a practicalist. And you're on some other metaphysical level, but I was just thinking in terms of actual practicality and thinking of real examples, which of course aren't always applicable when discussing these deep levels of metaphysics. But if I were to think of it as an inductive process, well, we all know the problem with well, I suppose that's not true. Ben, I'm just going to reiterate the problem with induction, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Essentially, the issue with induction is it's great. It comes up with a bunch of new stuff. However, and I'm sure you might have some words to say about this, Ben, based off of what I've learned in the world of philosophy, induction can never prove anything. And in order for induction to prove anything, it would have to rely on a posit. Now, this is an interesting one, because, for example, all of science, which doesn't include math, by the way, is an induction, based off of natural laws, based off of the posit of natural order. Does that sound good to you, Ben?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Now, of course, where there might be a slight deviation in us is that I am uncertain of whether we can guarantee this natural order or not. You, of course, and correct me if I'm wrong, believe that because God exists, there is natural order? Would that be a true statement?
I think that would be accurate.
Right, so that's where our slight deviation is. But because of that, that's where I was kind of questioning about A and B being impossible without A. How would you come up with such a statement? But I suppose if it's metaphysical, it makes no difference, because A and B are simple, they're ideas, they're not physical things.
Well, A and B, since we're just giving a hypothetical example, they could just be metaphysical things, but in real life you'd think about some event causing another event, or some state of affairs causing another state of affairs. And of course, these are metaphysical objects, events and state of affairs, but they're made up of time and matter and things like that.
Right. I'm simply suggesting that, based off of the problem with induction, which I believe, although I'm not the most well-read person out there, hasn't been solved yet, based off of that, I think that you can't necessarily be 100% certain that B is impossible without A, although hypothetically, in terms of metaphysicality, you could be, but in terms of practicality, I think assuming such certainty can't be done responsibly. But that's just me.
In any case, that would be a problem of practically trying to figure out whether one thing has caused another, and not trying to just define causation.
You're 100% right on that, so I'll stop interrupting you there.
But your comment or question, actually, it's quite similar, I think, to something that we're going to get into right now. That is what Hume thought about causation. So Hume was an empiricist. He didn't believe in a priori knowledge. He believed all knowledge is gained through experience. And so he thought, what kind of experience could possibly give us the knowledge that one thing causes another through necessity? No such experience could. And so if you're an empiricist,
you don't believe in that certainty?
Right, you don't, he saw no reason to believe that there is such a thing as modal causation, because we just couldn't have learnt it through the method we learn according to empiricism. So he thought that this causation thing was sort of a psychological aspect of humanity, that we've seen that certain things naturally follow other things so often that we've come to incorporate it into our thought, that the first thing sort of makes the second thing happen. And so Hume came to the conclusion, I think, that causation is sort of just events that are temporally linked, and that on a pattern basis happen together all the time. Now, there were problems with Hume's view here, which is why I don't think it's widely accepted anymore, although it is the basis for modern discussion of causation. For one thing, Hume's thing about causation not being able to be learned, Kant objected to that. He said that causation is a priori knowledge.
Right.
And I think other people have said that there might be some sort of causation that can be seen in things.
No?
I don't know. It's sort of like...
I'm a tad bit skeptical of that. I mean, a priori knowledge, I could believe that. If you believe that certainty can come from a priori knowledge, causation, that kind of thing, sure, fine, that makes sense. But if we're gonna go the route of Hume here, I think that based off of what Hume believed, he was correct in saying that certainty can't be learned or observed. I think the only way certainty could possibly happen is through a priori knowledge, if at all.
Right. Which is why John Stuart Mill actually thought the laws of mathematics could be overturned by more experience.
Wait.
He had an empiricist theory of the laws of logic and mathematics, which is really, really weird.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's the only thing that you can do to be a consistent empiricist. And, so yeah, these other people, I guess they thought that, I don't know, events sort of radiate some sort of knowledge of causation. I guess that doesn't really make all that much sense when you say it out loud. And I think there may have been a third response, but I don't remember what it was.
Right.
And there's a problem with Hume's own account of causation. The one about them being sort of linked as a pattern. That is that, if so, then we can say, for example, that the daytime causes the nighttime. Since they're linked temporally, and they always happen together in pairs. So I think I'm comfortable rejecting Hume. How about you?
Oh, well, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that by definition there is a rationality to his theory, and that I believe it's rational, but rationality in logic doesn't necessarily mean it's right.
Yeah, I guess that's correct.
So, and I applaud his logic, and I think he's being true to his beliefs in pursuing causality in the way he did. And I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with what he did. The only thing is that, like you mentioned, I'm trying to envision this here. The way I see it, I think that maybe a hardcore humist view on causality wouldn't work for me. But if there is some kind of, like, compatibilist version, I might be intrigued. One that acknowledges the imperfections of Hume's theory, but somewhat sticks with it.
So as for something compatibilist, you might say, for instance, that there is an exception, that if something happens in a pattern, that it's sort of going back and forth. Like with night and day, we see night, day. So you could either say day causes night or night causes day. And if it goes like that, then that proves as an exception to the rule. And so you might have a built-in exception to it. Something like that.
Potentially. Although, the thing with a theory like that is you would have to put little room aside for confounding variables, because humans aren't perfect and we don't have perfect knowledge. Therefore, we might not have all the necessary information to put forth something such as A causes B or B causes A in such case, where we might discover that it's neither, but instead C causes A and B at different moments in time and space, which would be the case for the whole day and night kind of problem.
Okay, but you're still talking about knowledge here, which doesn't really apply when we're talking about hypothetical instances.
Right. I was just talking about actuality because we brought up night day as real examples.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm simply suggesting that if you were to take a compatibilist view, you'd have to accept the fact that if you were to apply that theory, you have to leave room for imperfections in human knowledge.
Okay. So I guess we may as well move on
Right.
to, well, actually, before we get to my theory, I think there's something else I better mention that is some more modern attempts at a theory of causation. One of them is that of David Lewis, who is the same guy who came up with the nominalist concept of possible worlds as actual alternate universes. Now, his theory has something to do with possibility too, but he says it's not really about modal notions because, his possible worlds are actual universes. But not sure exactly how Lewis's thing goes, but it's quite complicated, I think. It has something to do with differences between the actual world and the most similar alternate universe. And I think we'd have quite extreme epistemological problems with this theory. How is it then that when you say something causes another thing, you somehow have knowledge of what's going on in another possible universe? I mean, not in another possible universe, in another actual universe. It doesn't really make sense to me. Any thoughts?
Well, that's interesting that you bring up the epistemological aspect, because A, you'd have to determine whether this is just some crazy thought, well, not maybe crazy, but some incorrect thought that somebody came up with, or B, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, if we're going to say that this is the case, where would such knowledge come from, and why?
Right. I don't see how our minds could have any knowledge of these alternate universes if they're real universes. On the other hand, if we have a realist conception of possible worlds, that they're abstract objects, metaphysical objects, then I think the human mind can have direct contact with metaphysical objects.
I agree. I mean, I think if we're going to have any contact with any alternative universes, so to speak, that's the only way to do it.
Absolutely. And in fact, our minds don't actually have contact with that tree over there, say. We only have contact with the sensations that tree produces in us, like the vision of the tree.
Although, to be fair, though, when it comes to thinking of alternate universes, you could make the argument that the only way we could envision it is based off of previous sensory information that we've gathered in this universe, but also to a certain degree, it's based off of a certain rational thinking done solely with the mind.
I think we can conceive of a possible universe in which there's no space or time, right? And so that couldn't be based in our experience. We might also think of something where there's some completely different, immense concept, like space or time, that we have no knowledge of, and it's impossible for us to imagine. But we can still conceive of the possibility that something like that could exist in another possible world.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I recall, Ben, a long time ago, we had a conversation about the laws of physics and possible other universes, and how logic might work differently in different universes, which you came to the conclusion that logic, by definition, cannot vary. Mathematics, because it is logical, can't vary just because you're in a different universe. But apart from that, if we're going to talk about the idea of a concept like space or time existing in an alternate universe, or very well existing in this one, and we just don't know about it, that's wholly conceivable.
Yeah, that is, because it's not. Space and time are, at least as I see them, contingent things, whereas logic is necessary. So I guess that's all for the alternate models of causation. Now on to my own model. So I decided to bring back the classical modal notion that I started developing my theory with something like A causes B if it is impossible that A occurs and B does not occur. So I said that in terms of a logical connection, but I suppose modal connections are a little different from logical connections, but they're conceivable in the same way. So we can go on like that. But the problem I brought on earlier about B causing C is the thing that led me, I think, to conclude that that cannot be all. So for one thing, I split causes into two categories: indirect causes and direct causes, where an indirect cause is a pretty easy concept. An indirect cause is just something that occurs along the same chain of direct causes earlier than its effect.
I like that definition.
So that one should be pretty easy to grasp, and I think that should be a well-accepted thing. Now, the direct part is harder, much harder, and that's the point of the theory. So I started coming up with characteristics that something has to match for A to cause B.
Ben? Sorry, I just had a thought. Hypothetically, could you have a, what do you call it? Not an unintentional effect, but a,
Unintentional?
I'm just trying to think.
Accidental?
No,
I don't know.
The specific word you used. The, secondary effect, or,
Indirect?
Indirect, yes, sorry. Could you hypothetically have an indirect effect of something happen after the direct cause happens, or direct effect?
Well, an indirect effect is just one of many direct effects. It's just one that's not connected with the thing that's its direct cause. I mean, it is connected, but it's just, we're looking at places farther along on the chain.
Right, so hypothetically, if we have the indirect effects before the direct effect, what would you call the things after the direct effect?
Well, further along, there would be more effects and more causes, but it's not as if the direct effect is a different item from the indirect effect.
It's all a matter of what place and time you decide to view it from.
It's a matter of which objects we're talking about. Like we could say A causes B, which causes C, which causes D. Now D is a direct effect of C, but it's an indirect effect of A.
So for example, let's say we were to be specifically looking at C. We would say that B directly causes C, A indirectly causes C. Then how would you define the relation? Right, you would define the relation between A and D if you're looking at C as indirect, right? That doesn't change?
No, it doesn't change. It's, yeah, you got it.
Alright, so basically direct is on. Alright, I think I've been cleared up here. Direct only refers to something caused directly by something. After effects would be considered indirect, and previous ones are considered indirect. It's only two items, or two things that are next to each other chronologically that are considered directly causing each other.
That's right.
Alright, I understand now.
Okay, so the most obvious characteristic I thought of was A and B must both occur. And then I also included the classical notion of it is impossible for A to occur and B not to occur. But instead of modifying that, I was adding characteristics onto it to more limit the field. At least that's what I was doing at that time. I might change it up later. Well, I do change it up later, but that's not something you need to know right now. So because of the B and C problem, I thought, well, suppose there's some sort of temporal relationship between cause and effect. And so I at one time thought A and B are simultaneous and instantaneous. So they're both points. You know, points are minimally small, and they occur at the same time. But not only does this actually not solve the original problem of B causing C, because then B actually does occur at the same time as C, so it can still be said to cause C. But if this were true, all the causes and effects of history would all occur at the same time, and that's a big problem. So, we might say B happens the moment after A.
Right.
But that doesn't work either under sort of the common sense idea of how time works. I've been trying to reform my idea of time, trying to figure out a theory of time that works. I can't. Time is impossible to figure out, at least so far. I'm hoping I get something figured out sometime soon, and maybe that would change what I'm saying here. But the reason I said B can't occur the moment after A is because there's no moment after another moment. If you consider a line, what's it called? You know, a line of points where you have like a number line? Number line, that's it. So if A occurs at point 1, where does B occur? 1.1, 1.01, 1.001?
Infinitely small distance away from 1.
Right, and so there's no such thing. So B can't occur the moment after A. And this is a good time for me to say that I actually have changed one of the ideas since I published this theory. That is, at the time I thought events caused other events, but now I'm saying instead that states of affairs cause other states of affairs, where a state of affair is a way a particular part of the world is at during some distance of time. I'm not sure exactly why I changed it. I don't exactly remember. But I trust my past self enough to stick with this change and think it's reasonable. So the idea I came up to accept in the end, is that A ends at the same time B begins.
Alright, so instead of there being an infinitely small distance between them, they're connected.
Right. So these events might occur, they might have some duration, or they might even be instantaneous events, some of them. So, for example, A could be instantaneous, but then B starts at the same moment as A and lasts for a while.
Right, because if something's instantaneous, then based off of this new definition of causality, if A is instantaneous, then B begins at the final moment of A, and by A being 1 moment, B begins during the 1 moment of A's existence.
Right. And I even added still another qualifier onto this, an exception. That is, I do think there can be causation beyond time. So if we suppose time doesn't exist, then in order for A to cause B, they both have to be eternal. Which is, I suppose, the same thing as there being instantaneous, but it doesn't present any problems beyond time, I think. Well, it's not the same thing as there being instantaneous, but it's equivalent for the purposes of thinking for now.
I'm pretty sure I understand what you're saying in terms of instantaneous and infinite, at least in terms of time and cause and effect. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I understand what you're saying.
Okay. But this still leaves a problem. Because suppose A causes B and C, and B causes D. Or actually, you know what, make it simpler. We should probably have C cause D. So A causes B and C causes D. B and C begin at the same time because they're both started by A.
Mm-hmm.
And for the purpose of this hypothetical illustration, B and C have the same duration. They last the same amount of time.
All right.
And that means that since C causes D, B ends at the same time that D begins, even though B did not cause D. And so even with this temporal relation, we still have B causing D when it in fact did not, so the definition is not yet done.
Right. So you haven't found a way to solve that problem yet?
In fact, I have, and that is the central point of my theory.
Alright, I'm intrigued.
So the central point is something I call causal law, which is the name of the theory too, because that's what it's centered around. So causal laws, first of all, are not the same as laws that respect causation. There may be laws about causation that are not causal laws. For example, we might have the law, anything that begins to exist has a cause, but that's not a causal law. A causal law is a law through which one thing necessitates another. So it's not enough that A necessitates B, it's that A necessitates B through this causal law.
So it's kind of, to put it into logic, it would be the same as mathematics in that causal laws state that by definition this is how it is. It's not, something like a natural law where it could possibly be wrong or whatnot. It's, as you mentioned before, would it be correct to call it a priori?
Yes, we would know causal laws a priori, I suppose. That's not to say that everybody just knows them, like they could just think of them instantly, just as the knowledge of mathematics is a priori, but you still have to reason it to figure it out.
Right.
And so I don't actually know what these causal laws are, and that's a big problem, but that is going to tie in, I guess, to my ontology quite a bit. That when I figure that out, I'll have causal laws as respect to changes in properties and changes and when particulars begin and end and things like that. And I think something we can suggest for now is that free agents or conscious agents like you and I and God and, I don't know, some angel.
No, would we count animals as free agents as well?
I would, yeah. Well, not jellyfish, but it depends on the animal, I guess. And it's somebody else's job to figure out which animals have spirits and which don't. But if you remember, before even mentioning the traditional notion of necessity for causation, I said something about a causal power.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking that agents have some sort of causal power, that if they want themselves to do things and that thing is within their power, then that thing will be done.
Ah, I see, alright. So that kind of circles back, you could say, to the episode we had where we talked about the notion of free will, and that free will and us being free agents allows us to enact this causal power.
I'm not sure if you have to be free to have the causal power. You could conceivably be conscious and have some other agent with more power controlling you or something, but it would still be done through you, and then you could cause something. I don't know. I don't think it's altogether necessary to know such a thing.
Alright.
But, so with God, for instance, basically his causal power is maximal. Anything that is logically possible is within his causal power. As for us agents, small agents, we're restricted, I suppose, by the fact that we're tied to our bodies. And now this is where you have to get into philosophy of mind, which I haven't worked out. I don't know. I think there are things in philosophy of mind that still need to be developed. Somebody needs to work on that pretty hard.
Well, you're not content with the mind-body dualism, or the homunculus living inside of you?
Well, I think there are problems with it. I mean, it sort of makes spirit into another type of matter. And, yeah, there are problems with that. But, for now we can just look at it by example and say, so you're a free agent, and if you want to move your hand, that is currently within your power, so you can move your hand. Of course, that wouldn't apply to somebody who's been amputated or something.
I suppose so.
But, yeah, that's over in the realm of philosophy of mind, so we'll just leave it there. And so, here I have a statement of my things for causal law in predicate logic. I guess I'll put that on screen. And I think that's all for my theory. All for now.
Alright, well, that was most interesting, I must say. I'm staring at your statement right now on your iPad. And I gotta say, it would probably do me some good to find some kind of formal logic class I could take at John Abbott. I'm not sure if they offer it as a humanity, but I would love to take that because I think it would definitely be beneficial.
I really wish they had a logic class there. I don't think they do. But the good thing is there are plenty of free logic textbooks on the internet.
Indeed, the tools to such things are available to us. We simply must use them.
That's right.
Alright, so at the beginning of the episode I mentioned, I made the claim that the UK is now a totalitarian state, and if you're anybody anywhere other than maybe North Korea or Iceland, actually no, that's insulting to Iceland, if you're anybody who knows anything and has access to TV or internet, you probably know about Tommy Robinson's arrest. It may not be hitting mainstream media, but the important things never do.
Well, I think probably only people who have videos show up in their recommended section of YouTube that are somewhat right-wing would have any knowledge of this.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I mean, even moderate conservatives and some liberals should know about it. But in any case, if I'm going to summarize the whole story, there's a guy named Tommy Robinson who lived in the UK. Well, I suppose still lives. He is still living. And, you know, I guess you could define him by today's definition as alt-right, because you could slap that on anything right of communist these days. But, yeah, definitely some specific views about Muslims and Muslim migrants, and like a lot of people in the UK, he wasn't necessarily happy with the current affairs of things. And, he did reports on it. He's had his life and his family's life threatened multiple times by people that don't like what he's doing, but that's never scared him. And some might even say that he's become a patriot of the working man in the UK, so to speak, who is not content with the ongoings of their government. But in any case, about a year ago or so, he was arrested for walking in to a court case. I believe, I don't know where the courthouse was, but walking into a court case and doing some reporting on that. He was arrested. He ended up, I believe, getting it waived, or he ended up being alright. But a lot of people have been speculating that the UK government probably doesn't like him. And, well, a few days ago, he was reporting on a case involving Muslim gang rapes and grooming of young girls in the UK for such things. And at one point, when some of the convicted people were walking into the courthouse, there was a bit of a discourse, a yelling match between Tommy Robinson and some of them. And apparently somebody, although I must admit, according to what I've heard, it was a rainy day, or was a very sparsely populated day, so to speak, around there. It was just him and I believe cameraman or one of his friends. Very few people, nobody outside his circle. Yet somehow somebody managed to call the police, claiming there was a breach of peace going on. So I believe it was something absurd, like 13 policemen showed up, and Tommy Robinson was arrested for breach of peace. He was brought to a courthouse where, apart from the breach of peace, he was charged with obstruction. I think it was obstruction of justice or interference in something. Basically, in the UK, they take a lot of crazy measures to make sure that people don't interfere with the jury, although that doesn't apply to mainstream journalists, of course, because they're pushing the right narrative. But in any case, he was arrested for that, and he was given 13 months jail time. And his defendant said that, based off of what he knows, putting him in jail would be willfully basically sending him to die, because he has so many threats. And, well, there was another guy who threw a bacon sandwich at a mosque who was sent to jail, and he was murdered in jail by Muslims. So I don't think it's completely unfounded fear for Tommy Robinson and his defendant to fear for his life. And the judge supposedly commented with, well, he knew what he was getting himself into. In any case, it kind of blew up since then. The UK, at the very beginning, put a reporting ban on it, which means that nobody is allowed to talk about it or even really mention it, although I suppose you could mention it, without risk of possibly being arrested, just like Tommy Robinson. And, well, that completely blew up in places outside of the UK where you could say people and alternative media in the US, Canada, basically places outside the UK or maybe in the EU, they were talking about it themselves. And I think a day ago they lifted the ban, the press ban. Then anyways, a whole crazy thing. And the crazy thing about it is that Tommy Robinson went from the streets to prison in a matter of 4 hours. And I'm not sure what goes on in your own country's legal system, but if it's anything like ours, it could take years and years for rapists or serial killers to even get to court, where they might have committed their crime in 2014, yet they still haven't even seen a courtroom yet, whereas it only took the UK government 4 hours to put Tommy Robinson away. Very interesting, but a lot of people are speculating that the UK government was planning this for a while and was just looking for an excuse to get rid of him, and they found their excuse, and they're hoping that Tommy Robinson will just kind of disappear from the public eye. However, I think there's been the opposite effect. I think now more than ever, it almost might have boosted Tommy Robinson's popularity in terms of people that know him, but my fear comes from the idea that a state such as the UK that prides themselves on never have being conquered or never being totalitarian, always being free to a certain degree, whatnot. If the government can A, throw someone in jail for such general and quite frankly bogus reasons in a matter of 4 hours, and then put a press ban on it, not only is that imprisoning those that dissent against the government, but you're stopping free speech. You're stopping people from even talking about it. First, there was free speech bans in terms of hate crime. Now you're not even allowed to talk about something such as that. And I think that it's reaching a bit of a tipping point where, you can take from Western people only so much before people start realizing, hey, this really is starting to be communist, this really is starting to be fascist, totalitarian, and they're not going to like it. There's a point where the majority of people, or even a big enough minority, is going to be unhappy with the way things are going. And one way or another, there's going to be some kind of a large event that's going to change how things go. There might be some kind of civil uprisings, potentially a civil war. I mean, any number of things could happen. But one thing that I think is going to happen is that the more a state takes away freedom of speech, the more it's risking a rebellion for that freedom of speech. I'm hoping that the UK never becomes like it's portrayed as in 1984. That's when the battle's already been lost. I'm hoping it never reaches that point. But the thing is, the longer that we wait, the more time is running out.
Well, I have a few comments on that.
Alright.
A few of them are kind of irrelevant or dumb, but I'll say them anyway. For one thing, I thought, how do you spread the information of a press ban on a certain subject?
I suppose you put out a public statement kind of thing.
I don't know, it seems like it might be spreading it. Just doing that.
Well, it would, Ben. It most certainly would.
Another thing I thought, that one sentence you said, my fear is that a state something something. And I was thinking I would just end it there. My fear is that a state.
Spoken like a true libertarian.
And then I had some more serious thoughts. The most relevant one is one that I just forgot. So that stinks. Oh yeah, it's that this reminds me of the case of Dinesh D'Souza, who's this conservative filmmaker, commentator, speaker, theorist guy. A while back, he accidentally made some sort of mistake. He accidentally broke some sort of rule in political donations, and Obama's government gave him like a few years for that in jail. And meanwhile, somebody else did basically the same thing and got, I don't know, like a month of community service work or something.
Yeah. And that speaks to the whole danger of the state having so much power. And I mean, I can understand why libertarianism is so attractive, and that give the government that much power, and it's bound to be abused. You know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and whatnot.
Yeah. And also, if you're listening to this, which you're probably not, well, I guess if I'm talking to you, you have to be listening to this. But don't quote me on that stuff about Dinesh D'Souza, because that's just from memory, so I don't know the exact facts. But, you know, something like that, so it was relevant. The other comment I had, the last one that I was thinking of at that time, was, my, how steeply you've climbed to this right-wing nationalism. I remember you never used to be like this, but now you're the resident political commentator on nationalism and free speech and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I suppose one thing you could say is that, to a certain degree, I've always been nationalist, where, whether it's patriotism or, you know, being involved in cadets and liking the military. Of course, libertarians would say that the military is just a tool of the state to subjugate its own people, if it becomes necessary, which is possible, although, quite frankly, I think that'd be maybe a pretty big fear, but I would hope that the military wouldn't have it within them to ruthlessly kind of put down their own people. I mean, the way I see it, the whole point of the military is to defend the country from outsiders invading forces, but also threats within. Now, the threats within isn't supposed to be its own people demanding rights. It's supposed to be terrorists and insurgent groups. That kind of thing within its own borders.
Mm-hmm.
The point of the military isn't to brutally crack down on political dissidents. And if a government uses the military that way, well, I'm not a supporter of that government.
Well, I suppose by that point you don't have a choice.
I suppose so. But in all frankly, I don't see myself as that much of a right-wing nationalist, although I suppose that's very relative. The way I see it is that I'm almost halfway between libertarian and maybe American Republican. I'm not sure if that's the proper way to analyze it. I've never been good at giving my own political ideology because, quite frankly, I don't think it's a constant thing. I think it's in a state of flux, so to speak.
So you're like a Tea Party person.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. But it's kind of like conflicting, where I can definitely sympathize and understand libertarians, but I also like the idea of nationalism and patriotism at the same time.
And I know you've observed my political drift from some weird random set of policies over to some social conservatism, to then libertarianism, to minarchism, to anarcho-capitalism. I'm wondering how this came about, your drift to where you are now.
Disillusionment with the left, I suppose. I'd say maybe, very much so thanks to you, I'd say. In, maybe beginning 10th grade there, I became more and more disillusioned with the left, and, the right-wingers that I always thought, they're over-exaggerating, they're propping stuff up, it really isn't that bad. I started to realize, hey, it kind of is that bad. And that's, I suppose, so to speak, when I would have been red-pilled, where... Oh, sorry, I just have a call.
All right.
Hello? Hey. Right, and then after that, it just kind of snowballed, so to speak, where I just became more and more disillusioned. I suppose I should also thank YouTube, where partially thanks to you, Ben, I was able to find a lot of maybe alt-right channels that the left likes to call it, but quite frankly, I think it's just reasonable channels. I think that just being able to maybe reinforce that way of thinking, and maybe the idea that, a lot of other people think that way, probably reinforced the fact that I was becoming disillusioned with the left, and I was starting to become more of a person of principle, as opposed to, say, a utilitarian, where in the past, you might recall this, Ben, when we were doing a simulation of the last federal election there, I was a really big fan of the NDP, because A, I liked Tom Mulcair. I liked him. I didn't like Justin Trudeau, and I thought that maybe the NDP would be able to do good for the country. Of course, the NDP didn't end up winning there. But, no, I ended up wanting them to win as opposed to the Conservatives. Thinking back, I'm not 100% sure why. I think maybe living in the leftist society had made me think that we need a leftist approach to this. And, to be fair, the NDP back then was nowhere near what it is today. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was to a certain extent, but it was nothing like, say, the snowflake party they got going on there with all the hate laws and back then. And the thing with Tom Mulcair is that, unlike Justin Trudeau, he was unwilling to take a stance on the, burqa, or the headscarf that covers the face of a Muslim woman there.
Hijab?
Hijab, right. Or you would expect a leftist party to say, they can wear hijabs all they want, we don't care. That's what Justin Trudeau was saying. And then Stephen Harper was saying, no, that's a danger to public security. And Tom Mulcair was on the fence. He didn't come up with a decisive decision, and a lot of people say that's one of the big reasons that he didn't win. He didn't stick strong to one side, his, uncertainty. But to me, I think that's one of the reasons why I liked him, because he was unwilling to just take the easy leftist way out, where I think he was actually thinking about the good of Canada, and he couldn't just choose the leftist path because he knew that it might endanger the country. He put the priorities and the good of the country first, above personal ideology. But in any case, that's what I was back then, and since I've definitely become a lot more right. And now I feel as if the left isn't what it was, and even when it was, might not have been what it used to be. And pardon.
That was kind of a fun sentence.
Right. I think that if you talk about, say, the scientific revolution and maybe late 18th, early 19th century kind of politics and personal freedoms and that kind of thing, I would say that I'm fine with it up until maybe the 60s. Well, I suppose it's hard to put a year on that since, well, year doesn't 100% correspond with my own opinions. But I think that a lot of things have been overdone and done wrong, and I think people have taken for granted, for example, things that maybe shouldn't be the way they are, and people are unwilling to question things because it's just the way it is, and they would be crazy if they were bringing it up in conversation with their friends. I think this fear of dissent from this, right answer, this right speak and wrong speak, the fear of being wrong and, being cast out has, for the most part, kept a lot of people in line. Because just like in China, with their own communist party, there's perks to be had if you agree with the government. In China, if you want to go to university, you gotta be in the Communist Party. If you want any future for yourself, you gotta join the Communist Party. At least any future in China. Doesn't work quite that way in the West, but if you want any real future in the West, well, you gotta be a leftist. Going against that is basically taking a chance. You don't get that guaranteed success. The government is no longer your friend, not that it maybe ever was, but it's an enemy, or at least a leftist establishment government. And when you have this this ideology kind of steadily controlling the government and becoming more and more extreme, where people would think that 4 years ago the way things were done was so backwards, back when 4 years ago people thought it was completely normal, the rate of ideological shift and the taking for granted of how things are and how they're supposed to be, that's the true danger, having people forget about how things were. That's very 1984-ish, If you don't remember a time before the war, or the time before, a crackdown on political dissidents, or the time before whatever, how can you strive for anything better if it's the way it's always been? Then you're a lot less likely to try to fight for something. That's why a lot of people have been making comments that there's not a lot of millennial conservatives, because what is there left to conserve?
Well, you're sort of on a roll there, but I'm afraid this so far is our longest episode,
right.
So we're going to have to cut it off right there. I'm Ben.
And I'm Thomas.
And this is The Philosophy Show with Ben and Thomas, and don't do drugs.